Curtis Sittenfeld, welcome to the Great Big Book Club.
Thank
I have literally just finished Rodham, your amazing book about Hillary Clinton, about half an hour ago. I can't tell you how much I enjoyed it.
thank you so much.
Do you have a copy of it there so we can just see the cover?
By remarkable coincidence, I do have a copy here.
It's such a brilliant book. I've got so many questions. I almost sort of kind of don't know where to begin. So the story, well, you explain the story.
So the premise of the book, in real life, um, Bill Clinton proposed to Hillary Rodham twice, and she said no. And then the third time, she said yes. And the premise of the book is, what if she had said no the third time also and gone her own way? And how would her life have played out differently? How would American history have played out differently? So it's sort of grounded in a fictionalized version of reality in the beginning, and Yale Law School in Arkansas in the early 1970s, and then it diverges greatly and goes up into 2015 and does get quite a bit into American politics.
I mean, when I was reading it, it's very difficult to work out what's fact and what's fiction, and it goes from one to the two seamlessly. I mean, all I could think of was what a lot of work. I mean,
Ha!
the level of research.
I mean, it's funny because, like, on the other side of things, it's always so hard to say, but there's a part of me that did not know quite how much work it would be. I mean, it was a lot of work. I mean, I don't know. I always feel like I should sort of, temper that by saying, I don't think writing novels is like the most brutally difficult job there is. But in the context of writing novels, and even in the context of my own novels, I think this one was the most challenging. And in fact, I did do a lot of research, and I did make a lot of decisions about, how to incorporate fact, how to make up fiction.
It's a really difficult choice to do that as well, and also because Hillary Clinton, Bill Clinton, White House politics is a specialized subject for a lot of people. It must be quite nerve-wracking to go into that hornet's nest as a relative newcomer, because I mean, you did do another book before about Laura Bush, didn't you?
Yeah, but no, it's accurate that I feel like details about politics are available. So, there's some things that information that's just not publicly available, including like some personal details about the Clintons. But like a person who's a political reporter or a political journalist could read sections of this and say, okay, this is factually correct, or this is plausible, or it's not. And so I did the stuff that it was possible to get right. I wanted to get right. And in fact, I have not, I'm sure it'll happen eventually, but the book came out, about 6 weeks ago in the US, and people have expressed some, levels of like negative feedback in addition to positive feedback. But I don't think so far anyone has said that this is factually wrong. I mean, there's stuff that's most of the book, in fact, is pure fiction, but in terms of, no one has said these are political or logistical details that are implausible.
What was it originally about? I mean, in order to take on such a massive subject, you've got to really love it. So, what is it about Hillary that you love so much? I mean,
Yeah, well, it's funny because
you must spend about 4 years with her, I presume.
It took me, so I started this book in March 2017. So I would say it took me about 2.5 years to write it. I mean, it was particularly intense at the end. But the funny thing about when you're saying it's a massive project, somehow delusionally, I thought to myself, it will be 120 pages. I thought of it as a small project, and it's like more than 400. But I mean, to answer your question, one, I do admire and respect Hillary. I think that she's really smart. I think she's a really hard worker. I think she's a tough, persistent person who's withstood a lot of criticism and a lot of sexism over many decades. And I think she's led this very complicated, colorful, rich, interesting life. So all of that, makes for very juicy fiction. I don't think it was like a foregone conclusion that I would write this novel. What happened was, first, in early 2016, an editor at Esquire magazine asked if I would like to write a short story from Hillary's perspective, because, as you mentioned, I wrote the novel American Wife, which came out in 2008 and was a fictionalized version of the life of Laura Bush. And also because of American Wife, a few editors had reached out to me, in 2015 and 2016, leading up to the election, and asked if I would like to write an essay about Hillary, and I would decline. And I just felt like I didn't have anything new or fresh to say about, what Hillary means to the American people, or what Hillary, represents, or what the American people think of her. But writing this short story, which of course was fictional, the question was not what do the American people think of Hillary, but what does Hillary think of the American people? And then I actually had a lot to say. So I had that experience of, I wrote that story. It was, about a sort of fictionalized Hillary as she's accepting the presidential nomination. And then after the 2016 election, which, like many people, I was surprised and horrified by the outcome. I had this slow realization that school children who knew Hillary was running often literally didn't know that Bill existed. And so I started to think to myself, well, what if adults also didn't see Bill and Hillary as such a sort of unit, or as so interconnected? Would the outcome of the election have been different?
It's amazing. So the book starts with, but it's written in the first person, which also I find fascinating. What just before we get going, why did you choose the first person?
I almost can't imagine writing a book like this not in the first person. Like, there's this, of course, to write a book like this, there's this it's an act of sort of, nerviness or like artistic presumption. But if you're going to go for it, you have to go for it. Like, just don't bother otherwise. So I kind of felt like I'm putting on my pantsuit, I'm putting on my blonde wig, like I am inhabiting Hillary. I am looking at the world through her eyes. So to me, of course, it's in first person. Like, that's the way to make it personal and real and vivid.
At the beginning of the book, she meets Bill right at the beginning, and she describes him as a lion. And I mean, at the beginning of the book, you quite fancied Bill. Well, I certainly did. I mean, he's obviously really good looking, very charismatic, and quite up for it. And there's right at the beginning, he takes her to a Rothko exhibition, doesn't he, and woos her with the Rothko. I mean, did that happen, or I mean, what are your feelings about the young Bill?
So the way that they meet in the book, like they see each other a few months in advance, and then they end up meeting in the library, and then they go on a date, and the museum is closed, but they pick up sort of trash and are allowed in. That's all true, actually. That's part of the public record. I mean, of course, like, I spend maybe 100 pages on their courtship and their falling in love. In their own books, they spend many fewer pages. And so almost all of the dialogue is made up, almost not 100%, but probably 95% of the sort of feelings and what's described. And certainly any smooching or other physical contact is made up. They don't really give I mean, she has at least two autobiographies, Living History and What Happened, and then he has this 1,000-page memoir, My Life. And so I certainly borrowed the details that were publicly available, but to really fill it in, I had to make up a lot. And so again, it's grounded in factual details when factual details were available. But, and even like they go to this diner, which was a real diner, but like I don't know what the inside of it really looked like, or or like I did, I was looking online at pictures of the Yale University Law Library, and I have been on the campus of Yale University, but it's, I mean, again, I kind of took things as far as I could research-wise, although I also am comfortable changing details to sort of serve the story. A lot of times it's almost like I want to change a detail because it's somehow useful or interesting, and not just because I've like gotten it wrong.
How brave do you have to be to write about Bill and Hillary having sex in a car? Because I mean, there's that brilliant moment when he's driving along and he suddenly gets all erotically overexcited. And I was thinking, these are two massive political icons. It must be quite difficult to write a scene like that.
Well, maybe it should have been more difficult. Like, I mean, that's a complicated question to answer, because here we are like having this conversation about my having written that sex scene, and it's sort of like inherently a little bit funny, a little bit awkward to discuss, but it's almost like I probably wrote that, who even know, like 2 years ago or something. And in the moment when I wrote it, like, you have to remember, I was wearing my metaphorical pantsuit and my metaphorical blonde wig. And I was thinking to myself, here are these two people, they're in their mid-20s, they're madly in love. It's a beautiful summer night. They've just reunited after not having seen each other for a few months. She's moved to Arkansas, the state where he lives and is from, for them to start their new grown-up life together. They finished law school. And it just felt like including their physical attraction was a really organic, natural part of the book. And like, I want the reader to feel conflicted. I didn't want to erase Bill from the historical record, and I didn't want to make the decision to not marry him easy for the fictional character of Hillary, because impossible choices are kind of terrible in life, but they're great in fiction. And a lot of readers have said, oh my God, I felt so upset when they broke up that I had to remind myself that in fact they stayed together in real life. So again, just like to include sex seemed natural. And I think, sex appears, as I'm sure in many novels, but the kind of conversation, like if you think, okay, it's Hillary and Bill, like then that can seem, maybe very weird. But if you think of it as these young people in their 20s in the 1970s, I don't think it's weird at all, actually.
You're brilliant on Bill Clinton's appetites. There's a lot of he's almost controlled by his appetite. So he's controlled. There's a brilliant scene where he's with Hillary and they're having ice cream sundaes. Not only does he have one ice cream sundae, he has 2 ice cream sundaes, and then he starts dipping his French fries or chips into the ice cream sundae. And this is sort of a theme that goes through the whole book about poor Bill and his appetites. It's either food or sex. I mean, he's feeding the beast, isn't he, in a sort of weird way?
Yeah, I mean, well, it's funny, when you were asking before, like I want the reader to sort of, feel like they're falling in love with Bill the way Hillary does, or to feel ambivalent about him. And that's one of the reasons that I like fiction, is that I think it acknowledges how complicated and contradictory the same person can be. The same person can have incredibly appealing qualities and incredibly repellent, damaging qualities. And I certainly think in real life, Bill Clinton does. And I tried to capture that in fiction.
He's a very charismatic figure in real life and obviously in the book. Um, what I do find also extraordinary is your portrayal of Hillary, is that she's been bullied from a very early age by her father, hasn't she?
So, which again, the great majority of that is fictitious, although some of the details are true. Like there's a biography of her called A Woman in Charge by the journalist Carl Bernstein. And it does talk about, Hillary was the oldest and then she had two brothers. And for example, if any of them left the toothpaste cap off the tube, he would throw it out the window, no matter how cold it was, and make them go get it. So I think her mother was a very loving, supportive presence in her life. And I think that her father was kind of a jerk, but there's not that much factual information available about her father. So I did take many creative liberties in terms of his dialogue.
Yeah, then their dialogue together is very, very funny. There's a funny and sort of sharp. It's very sharp. There's a line when she said, he says, "I wish Carol Moseley Brown was my daughter," and she says, "I do too," which is so you can tell. And he's constantly undermining her and constantly putting her in her place, which I suppose inspires her, fuels her fire and her anger to prove him wrong, I think.
Mm-hmm. I mean, I think that's definitely, I think I sort of explored that. I honestly don't know if it's true in real life. Like the weird thing is, because I wrote this book, I think my experience is almost the opposite of a reader's, where a reader might think like, what's true and what's not true. And to me, it's so clear. It's like, this is fact. This is what I made up. This is fact. And what I made up is, 85% of it.
And Bill Clinton's background too is incredibly destructive. I mean, I had no idea that. So his mother had 3 husbands die before she was 50.
Yeah, and that his mother was pregnant with him when his father died, his biological father. So he never knew his biological father. Yeah, and then he had a stepfather who was very violent. I mean, on their sort of extended first date, they kind of confide in each other about their upbringings, and the details that he tells her are in fact factually true. They're from his autobiography. Again, I mean, it's such a weird thing because so much of the book is made up, but that does happen to be borrowed from real life.
And you're very interesting on the sort of and sexism of that period. Poor Hillary is constantly undermined, that being told that no one's ever going to fancy her because she's not very attractive, and boys don't make passes at girls in glasses. I mean, that idea that clever girls should be told to be quiet and leave the room.
Yeah, I mean, I'm not so sure that that's like a, like function of past sexism. I think that even today, women are often made to feel that they can be smart or, sort of attractive, but not both. But yeah, I think certainly, and that too, in real Hillary's defense, that's sort of a made up dynamic. I mean, people will talk about, like, I was influenced by a book by a New York Times journalist named Amy Chozick, who has written about Hillary for a long time, including writing a book about the 2016 campaign called Chasing Hillary. And something Amy Chozick has said is she doesn't think that Bill is far more attractive than Hillary, but it's sort of known that Hillary thinks that, and that she always thought it was revealing. Chozick always thought it was revealing that's Hillary's view of the dynamic between them.
Also, you're very good on the idea of sacrifice, so that Bill Bill can basically live any life that he wants and still have a crack at the presidency, whereas Hillary has to be totally squeaky clean. So she doesn't even have an affair with the poor man James, who's clearly madly in love with her, and then ends up very sadly.
Spoiler alert!
No, I haven't said I didn't finish the sentence. I promise you I didn't. Very sadly, yes. Anyway, and you're very interesting on that. There's a line in the book when it says about sexism is that when a woman with as many skeletons in her closet can run for president, then that is true. Then that is equal opportunity.
Yeah, I mean, I do think, certainly in the United States, although I think in other countries too, I think that we hold women who run for elected office to a much different standard than we hold men to. And even, I mean, in the United States, in many cases, it's almost like, you know, there are women who have run for president, or where there's like one or two extremely well-known negative stories about them. And even that in itself is telling, where it's kind of like, you know, they've made few enough mistakes that you can kind of keep those mistakes straight. Whereas in some ways, it almost seems like a strategy that certain male politicians, you know, transgress like 4 times a day, and that it all just blurs together and they're not really held accountable.
But you're in your book, Hillary is absolutely held accountable for an incident in the back of a car. And I don't know if I should say what it is, but it's and she's completely, nearly completely destroyed by this, and it's an incredibly banal incident, actually.
Yeah, I mean, again, I think that I included that, like, it's interesting the way that a scandal kind of plays out for a political figure, because I think some of it, like, I think sometimes the public can have an appetite for a scandal that's like vivid and juicy and easy to understand, even if it's sort of not as big a deal as some like complex behind the scenes, like legal sketchiness. Yeah, there's so I do think that there's almost like the level of attention bestowed on a political screw up is not always you know, kind of in keeping with how big a deal it really is, and often the opposite.
And you're also brilliant on the idea of the sort of the Yale Ivy League sort of rite of passage straight from university to Capitol Hill. And there are various characters who you meet in the canteen, more or less, at the beginning, or in photographs, who then turn up later on in positions. So, I mean, they always say in the UK that we have a sort of an old boy network and a class system, but I think actually reading your book in America, it's very similar.
Oh, I think so too. I mean, there's definitely, and you see that in, you know, the sort of political infrastructure of you know, yeah, all sorts of like judge appointments and people who, you know, are on staff in the White House, or, you know, ambassadorship appointments. Absolutely.
And they're all sort of looking after each other and patting each other on the back. I mean, one of my favorite sort of stories in your book is the story, the Anita Hill story, which is and contains that famous line about a Coke can.
Oh, I mean, so that too, in a few cases in the book, I quote actual kind of public statements that were made. And so one is, you know, when the Supreme Court Justice Clarence Thomas, when his confirmation hearings occurred in the fall of 1991, and a former colleague of his, Anita Hill, said that he had sexually harassed her. And I use her actual statement, which I found to be incredibly powerful. I think I was 16 years old when that happened. And I watched, some of her testimony, and to read it as an adult. And I believe she was in her mid 30s at the time. And so now, when it happened, I was much younger than she was. Now I'm much older than she was at the time. And it is something to think about. Like, she was a younger Black woman. She was a lawyer and law professor, facing this panel of all white male senators. And just to think about what that must have been like is, it's very poignant and powerful. I think maybe even more so in retrospect.
And the adversary, what's his name again? He was actually at Yale as well, wasn't he? And
Clarence Thomas.
Yes. And he was famous for his wild talk.
Oh yeah. Well, so there's a really interesting book that I read that kind of goes deep into Clarence Thomas's childhood, Anita Hill's childhood, the actual hearings, which were led by Joe Biden. So it's an interesting, history and fate are crazy, and truth is stranger than fiction, as they say.
And there is a wonderful cameo role towards the end of your fantastic book when Donald Trump turns up. And he must be a sort of writer's gift. I mean, when I was reading that, I laughed out loud because of his use of language is priceless, isn't it?
Well, it's funny because I actually, I was very kind of clinical about trying to capture his voice, where I don't follow him on Twitter, but I would read his tweets, or in a few cases, I watched his public appearances on television or his speeches, and I transcribed the words he was saying just to kind of get a feeling for his language, to try to be able to mimic it. And I think it's been terrible having him as president. So it's a weird, like his role in the book. I mean, in a way, I think that I was kind of trying to rewrite history, or change what happened to the United States in 2016. But I recognize the limits of what I can do, and he is still the president right now, and has very concrete effects on the lives of many Americans, especially vulnerable Americans. And so it's not, I don't know. I mean, I don't I almost wish that I sort of could have a greater effect on changing his role. But unfortunately, changing it in a novel is not the same as actually changing it.
And it is also a really interesting part of history, because it's like moving from old school to sort of new school. So it was the old, when Bill and Hillary first were going out in Yale, it was slightly almost like the sort of halcyon days of, and there was hope and things, you could change things just by working hard and being honest. And then towards the end of your book, it becomes a sort of pea soup of backhanders and just the cabal. I mean, it really is the swamp, actually, isn't it?
I mean, it's that's an interesting way of seeing it. The weird thing is, if you said to me, sometimes people will say, well, what's the message of your book? And I'll think, if there was one message that I could boil down into a sentence, I would not have written 400 pages. And so I feel almost like my job is to create believable scenes and three-dimensional characters, and conflict and contradictions. And but it's not like, if like, sometimes people ask me these really basic questions about politics, or even about, like, one time I was doing an interview and someone said, is Hillary Clinton a centrist? And I thought, I don't know. I mean, I guess it depends on your definition of centrist. Um, but that's not, I mean, even though I'm certainly a voter, I care about politics, I think this is a political novel, but it's not an opinion piece. Like, I'm not making one concise argument.
I mean, we've had two female prime ministers in the UK. Do you think America will ever vote in a woman?
Yes. And I actually think, I mean, I guess I'm not powerful enough to jinx us, so I can say, I mean, I think it's actually very plausible that it'll even be in like 2024. Like, Biden will choose a female vice president. Of course, I desperately hope that Biden will be elected. I mean, the poll numbers really support that now, although anything can happen between now and November, and anything can happen with the elections. But yes, I think that there's something so strange about the limits of human imagination, where sometimes we can't imagine, or we almost can't fathom something that hasn't happened yet. And then when it has happened, it seems like it was inevitable and a foregone conclusion.
And why do you think it's so difficult for women in American politics?
Because I think that the United States is full of sexism.
Oh, that's old chestnut.
I mean, yeah, like, I don't think there's any other. I don't think it's like, oh, there haven't been qualified candidates, or, yeah, I just think that that there are voters who can't wrap their head around voting for a woman, and I think some voters know that about themselves and some don't. And then I think there are voters who can. I mean, the reality is, of course, Hillary won more votes than Trump did in 2016, but just because of the electoral college, she's not in the White House. So yeah, I mean, I think that, like, people like to say, like, oh, Hillary is uniquely polarizing, which I certainly don't buy into. Like, I think that's a convenient way of sort of looking at it. But then in some ways, both the, like, successes and the lack of successes of the female candidates in this election cycle, I think, shed light on Hillary, where I think that by most measures, the female candidates were more qualified and more appropriate choices, and like different from one another, like Kamala Harris, Elizabeth Warren, Amy Klobuchar. And so I think that it kind of highlighted the fact that when people would say, well, I want to elect a woman, just not that woman, meaning Hillary. Like, I'd love to have a female president, but just not Hillary. And it's like, well, and also just not Kamala Harris, and just not Amy Klobuchar, and just not Elizabeth Warren, but definitely some woman. Yeah, I mean, it's kind of ridiculous.
And having spent sort of 2.5 years or 3 years in your pantsuit with your blonde wig on, and your thick specs, or not thick specs, towards later on, do you love Hillary more than you did at the beginning?
So I had a high opinion of her from the beginning. But yes, I do. I think that I do feel, at the risk of sounding ridiculous, I do feel a sort of emotional closeness to her, where, if I hear her voice, like, I kind of think, oh, like my Hillary. Or if she mentions, her mother, it's very often very touching. Or, like, I think she's very close to Chelsea and very proud of Chelsea. And I mean, she's very much like a real vibrant person to me. But I also recognize that my closeness to her is not mutual. It's one-sided.
Have you ever actually met her?
I have never met her. I've heard her speak, but I've never met her.
And having done such a big project, which has been a sort of labour of love and very intense and lots of research, I presume now you're launching it into the world, but do you feel slightly bereft having finished it, or are you relieved to having finished it?
It's funny. It's funny because it's a little bit like when you were saying, "Oh, do you think the United States will ever elect a female president?" And I think, like, of course, eventually. Like, there are times when I think I will never finish this novel. Like, like the more I write and the more I research, the more work I have to do. So, and then it's finished, and then or sometimes it's like taking like a transatlantic flight. Like, in the middle, you think this plane will never land, and then it lands, and it feels like it went by in the blink of an eye. So, I don't know. It's a strange having books published. I do think is strange. For me, it's much stranger than writing them, and they're almost opposite experiences. Where to write a book, for me, it's like kind of going away in a cave by myself and just like thinking about things and trying things and writing scenes. Whereas, and it's very sort of isolated by necessity. And then to promote a book is to like interact with other people and also like the book is itself, and it doesn't explain itself. It's this story, and then to talk about the book is to explain the book, or to kind of, it's almost like allowing yourself to be pinned down or to like express certain opinions. And so there is something kind of strange about like the ways of using your brain and public versus private. But I certainly consider myself extraordinarily lucky that I get to be a fiction writer and write books about the topics that are interesting to me.
I completely understand that. But it's one of those sort of weird things, having lived and loved something for so long, sometimes it's quite hard to let it go.
Yeah.
And also I wondered, I mean, I presume you're having a hiatus, or do you have another thing that you're thinking about?
Well, it's funny because I feel like it's just sort of easier for me to exist in the world when I'm writing fiction. Like, I just think, my brain functions a little more smoothly. And so a few weeks ago, I thought like, I've got to start writing again. And, like, just like almost, I do read my own reviews, but like reading reviews, being on social media, like is kind of unhealthy. And so I was talking to my American agent and my American editor and saying, these are some ideas I have. And they both said, why don't you take a break, Curtis? Why don't you put your feet up? Which I feel like who knows if the ideas were not that enticing to them. And a part of me thought like, oh, I don't even care right now about, like the sales or whatever of some future idea. Like, I just want to be writing for the sake of writing. And I have been doing a little bit of it, but like there's a short story that I'm working on now. Like, I'm kind of doing little more bite-sized projects.
So you're not tempted to dive back into sort of it's almost like historical fiction what you were writing in a sort of weird way. It's the same techniques that you use in historical fiction. Taking what bits you want and moving on and plotting. So there isn't anyone who's caught your eye and you're thinking, I might have a go with them.
So 12 years elapsed between when I wrote American Wife and when I wrote Rodham. And I think I might write a similar novel at some point, but it will not be my next novel. Absolutely. I think I want to write something kind of fun and escapist and really short that doesn't require research.
I totally understand. Well, listen, congratulations on your book, Rodham. It's unbelievably good. I was gripped. I loved it. made me laugh. It took me on a massive journey, and I learned a hell of a lot, and it was brilliantly entertaining. So thank you so much.
Thank you. That's lovely. Thank you so much. And thank you for talking to me today.